There is no such thing as British DNA, not in the way most people imagine it. If you think of the British as a single, ancient, genetically unified people who have occupied the island since time immemorial, the DNA will correct you, brutally. Because the British Isles have been invaded, settled, colonized, and genetically overwritten more times than almost any comparable landmass on Earth. And every invasion left a layer, a genetic fingerprint that scientists can now read like pages in a book. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who arrived after the Ice Age, the Neolithic farmers who replaced them, the Bronze Age Beaker people who replaced the farmers, the Iron Age Celts, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, layer after layer after layer, each one adding new genetic material, each one partially erasing what came before. The person who calls themselves English today is a walking archaeological site, with genetic strata from at least 7 major population movements compressed into a single genome. And the most shocking part? The people who lived in Britain before the Anglo-Saxons arrived are not the ancestors of most English people today. The DNA says the English are, in large part, continental imports. Let's start at the bottom layer, the oldest DNA in Britain. After the last ice age ended roughly 12,000 years ago, as the glaciers retreated and the land bridge connecting Britain to continental Europe was still intact, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers moved into the newly habitable islands. These were the original Britons, the first humans to settle the land after the ice. Their most famous representative is Cheddar Man, a skeleton discovered in Gough's Cave in Somerset and dated to roughly 10,000 years ago. When scientists sequenced his DNA in 2018, the results made headlines around the world. Cheddar Man had dark brown to black skin, blue eyes, and dark curly hair. The earliest known Briton did not look like what most modern British people would expect. Cheddar Man belonged to the Western hunter-gatherer population that inhabited Europe after the Ice Age. These people left very little genetic legacy in modern Britons. They were largely replaced by the next wave. Around 6,000 years ago, Neolithic farmers from Anatolia and the Mediterranean arrived in Britain, bringing agriculture, domesticated animals, and a completely different genetic profile. Within a few centuries, they had replaced roughly 90% of the existing hunter-gatherer population. The people who built Stonehenge were these Neolithic farmers, not the Mesolithic hunters who came before them. Britain's famous megalithic monuments were constructed by a population that had arrived from the continent relatively recently. Then came the Beaker people. Around 4,500 years ago, a new wave of migration swept into Britain from continental Europe, associated with the Bell Beaker culture and carrying significant ancestry from the Yamnaya steppe herders. Within a few centuries, the Beaker people had replaced roughly 90% of the Neolithic population's gene pool. This is one of the most dramatic population turnovers in European prehistory. The people who built Stonehenge were almost entirely replaced by a new population, who then continued to use the monument their predecessors had created. These Beaker-descended people became the Bronze Age and Iron Age population of Britain. They are the people most commonly referred to as the Ancient Britons, or loosely, the Celts. But here, the DNA delivers another surprise. A 2015 study from the People of the British Isles project analysed DNA from over 2,000 modern Britons and found there was no single Celtic genetic group. The Welsh, Cornish, Scots and Irish, all traditionally considered Celtic peoples, are genetically distinct from each other. Cornwall is more similar to England than to Wales. Scotland has multiple internal genetic clusters. The romantic notion of a unified Celtic race occupying all of Britain before the Romans is a myth. A groundbreaking 2025 study published in Nature added another twist. Researchers analysing 57 ancient genomes from Iron Age burial sites in southern Britain discovered evidence of matrilocal communities where men moved to live with their wives' families rather than the reverse. They also found a significant increase in continental European ancestry flowing into southern Britain during the Iron Age, suggesting large-scale population movement across the English Channel long before the Romans arrived. Celtic languages may have been introduced to Britain through these pre-Roman migrations, not by a single dramatic invasion. Then came Rome. In 43 CE, the Roman legions invaded and occupied Britain for nearly 4 centuries. Roman York, Londinium, Bath, and dozens of other settlements were established. But the genetic impact of the Roman occupation was surprisingly small. A study of ancient DNA from a Roman-era cemetery in York found that 6 of 7 individuals had genetic profiles similar to modern Welsh populations, suggesting continuity with the pre-Roman Celtic population. The Romans brought soldiers, administrators, and traders from across the empire, including individuals with North African and Near Eastern ancestry. But these newcomers were a thin layer on top of a large indigenous population. The real genetic earthquake came after Rome fell, the Anglo-Saxon migration. In 2022, a landmark study published in Nature analyzed 460 medieval genomes from across northwestern Europe, including 278 from England. The results were staggering. In early medieval English graveyards, the average proportion of continental Northern European ancestry, similar to that of modern Northern Germans and Danes, was 76%. This was not an elite takeover. This was mass migration. Hundreds of thousands of people crossed the North Sea from what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, and settled in eastern and central England. The study found that immigrants and locals were buried side by side, and that intermarriage began almost immediately. Women with immigrant ancestry were more likely to be buried with continental-style brooches and beads, while men of local British ancestry were just as likely to carry weapons as their immigrant counterparts. The Anglo-Saxon transformation was not a genocide. It was a demographic revolution, a massive influx of continental people who mixed with and gradually absorbed the local British population. In modern England, the continental Northern European ancestry from this migration accounts for roughly 25 to 40% of the gene pool, having been diluted over the centuries by subsequent events. But the impact was profound enough to replace the Celtic Brittonic language with Old English, a West Germanic tongue, across most of the island. The language you are hearing right now exists because of this 5th and 6th century migration. The Vikings came next. Starting in the late 8th century, Norse raiders and settlers arrived from Scandinavia. Norwegian Vikings settled in Scotland, the Northern Isles, and Ireland. Danish Vikings conquered and settled the Danelaw, a vast territory covering northern and eastern England. The genetic study of modern Britain found that Orkney has the highest Scandinavian ancestry in the British Isles, with roughly 25% of DNA coming from Norwegian ancestors. In parts of northern and eastern England, Danish Viking ancestry is detectable but modest, blended into the existing Anglo-Saxon and Celtic layers. In 1066, the Normans conquered England. The Normans were themselves descendants of Viking settlers who had colonized northern France and adopted French language and culture. Their genetic impact on England was real but relatively small, concentrated among the ruling elite rather than the general population. A second wave of French-related ancestry, detectable in modern English DNA, likely reflects both the Norman conquest and subsequent centuries of cross-channel interaction. And here's the finding that ties everything together. The 2015 People of the British Isles study found that many of the genetic clusters in modern Britain correspond almost exactly to the boundaries of the early medieval kingdoms that existed after the Anglo-Saxon settlement around the 6th century. The tribal territories of the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and surviving British kingdoms left genetic borders that persist to this day. County boundaries in modern England, drawn centuries later, often follow the same lines. The genetic map of Britain is, in many places, a map of the Dark Ages, frozen in DNA for 1,500 years. The British genome is not one story, it is 7 stories stacked on top of each other. Mesolithic hunters with dark skin and blue eyes, Neolithic farmers who built Stonehenge, Beaker people who replaced the builders, Iron Age Britons with continental connections and matrilocal communities, a thin Roman layer with occasional Mediterranean and North African DNA, a massive Anglo-Saxon migration that replaced the language and transformed the gene pool. Viking settlers from Norway and Denmark, and a Norman-French elite who ruled from the top. Every British person alive today carries some combination of all of these layers. The proportions vary by region, by family, by the specific history of the village or town their ancestors called home. But the layers are always there, compressed into a single genome, telling a story of invasion after invasion after invasion, each one adding to the code, none of them fully erasing what came before. The next time someone says they are pure English or 100% British, remember, there is no such thing. There never was. The British genome is one of the most layered, most invaded, most mixed genetic codes in Europe. And that complexity is not a weakness. It is the source of everything the British Isles became. The archive never closes. If the hidden genetic stories inside every nation are what keep you watching, subscribe to DNA Archives and turn on notifications, because no country's DNA is simple, and Britain's is one of the most complicated of all.